Hey y'all, Matthew here with J&D Books. Today I want to start a really cool book series that is close to my heart. Uh, that might sound cliche, but it's one that I found by accident, but I really love it. It is off. It's called Safehold. Is the series. It's by the author David Weber. I'll put a picture up here in just a moment of that book and where you can find it. Uh, Basically, the premise is Earth is dead, humanity is hiding. Invention, progress, change are all forbidden. It's time to change all that. The science fiction epic of the decade begins here. After a massive war with alien Gbaba, survivors of the human race retreat to the planet Safehold, where they sacrifice basic human rights and an accurate memory of the Gbaba for the preservation of the species. The colony's founders psychologically program the colonists to prevent the reemergence of scientific inquiry, higher mathematics, or advanced technology, which the Gbaba would detect and destroy. Centuries later, cultural stagnation on this feudal but thriving planet is enforced by the all-powerful Church of God awaiting. But once kingdom, with the aid of war's last survivor, a cybernetic avatar that awakens to reinvent itself as a man named Merlin Athrals, risks committing the ultimate heresy, shifting effortlessly between battles among warp-speed starships and among ore-powered galleys. Weber brings political maneuvering, past and future technologies, and vigorous protagonists together for a cohesive, engrossing whole. It is a very cool book series. If you like fantasy, if you like sci-fi, and if you like historical fantasy, it's a really nice blend of all of that. So, without further ado, off Armageddon Reef by David Weber. As you can see, this one is taped. It's been very well read. This will be my fourth time reading through it with you guys. So, apologies for the rough look of the book. Chapter 1. July 2nd, 2378. Crestwell's Star, HD 63077A, Terran Federation. Captain to the bridge! Captain to the bridge! Captain Mateus Fafeo rolled out of bed as the urgent voice of the officer of the watch blared over the intercom counter, pointed by the high-pitched wail of the emergency general quarters signal. The captain's bare feet were on the deck sole, and he was already reaching for the bedside comm before his eyes were fully open, and he jabbed the red priority key purely by feel. Bridge. The response came almost instantly, in a voice flat with the panic-resisting armor of training. It's the captain, Chief Kuznetsov, Fafeo said crisply. Give me Lieutenant Henderson. Aye, sir. There was a brief instant of silence and then another voice. Officer of the deck, it said. Talk to me, Gabby, Fafeo said crisply. Skipper, Lieutenant Gabriella Henderson, the heavy cruiser's tactical officer, had the watch, and her normally calm contralto was strained and harsh. We've got bogies, lots of bogies. They just dropped out of hyper 12 light minutes out, and they're headed in system at over 400 gravities. Fafeo's jaw clenched. 400 gravities was 20% higher than the best Federation compensators could manage, which pretty conclusively demonstrated that whoever these people were, they weren't Federation units. Strength estimate, he asked. Still coming in, sir, Henderson replied flatly. So far, we've confirmed over 70. Fafeo winced. All right. He was astounded by how calm his voice sounded. Implement first contact protocols, and also spyglass and watchman. Then take us to condition 4. Make sure the governor is fully informed and tell her I'm declaring a code alpha. Aye, sir. I'll be on the bridge in 5 minutes, Fafeo continued as his sleeping cabin's door opened and his steward loped through it with his uniform. Let's get some additional recon drones launched ahead for these people. Aye, sir. I'll see you in 5, Fafeo said. He keyed the comm off and turned to accept his uniform from the white-faced steward. In actual fact, Mateus Fafeo reached the command deck of TFNS Swiftsure in just under 5 minutes. He managed to restrain himself to a quick, brisk stride as he stepped out of the bridge elevator, but his eyes were already on the master plot, and his mouth tightened. The unknown vessels were a scatter of ominous ruby chips bearing down on the binary system's geo primary component and the blue-white marble of its fourth planet. "Captain on the bridge," the chief announced, but Fafeo waved everyone back into his or her bridge chair. "As you were," he said, and almost everyone settled back into place. Lieutenant Henderson did not. She rose from the captain's chair in the center of the bridge, her relief as Fafeo's arrival relieved her of command obvious. He nodded to her, stepped past her, and settled himself in the same chair. "The captain has the ship," he announced formally, then looked back at Henderson, still standing beside him. "Any incoming transmissions from—" "No, sir. If they'd begun transmitting the instant they dropped out of Hyper, we'd have heard something from them about—" The lieutenant glanced at the digital time display. "2 minutes ago. We haven't." Fafeo nodded. Somehow, looking at the spreading cloud of red icons on the display, he wasn't surprised. "Strength update?" he asked. "Tracking estimates a minimum of 85 starships," Henderson said. "We don't have any indications of fighter launches yet." Fafeo nodded again, and a strange, singing sort of tension that was almost its own form of calm seemed to fill him up. The calm of a man face to face with disaster for which he has planned and trained for years but never really expected to confront. "Watchman?" he asked. "Implemented, sir," Henderson replied. "Antelope got underway for the hyperlimit about 2 minutes ago. Spyglass? Activated, sir." "That's something," a detached corner of Fafeo's brain said. TFNS Antelope was a tiny, completely unarmed, and very fast courier vessel. Crestwell's world was the Federation's most advanced colonial outpost, 50 light years from Sol, too sparsely settled, to have its own hypercom yet. That left only courier ships, and at this moment, Antelope's sole function was to flee solward at her maximum possible velocity, with the word that Code Alpha had come to pass. Spyglass was the net of surveillance satellites stretched around the periphery of the star system's hyperlimit. They were completely passive, hopefully all but impossible to detect, and they weren't there for Swiftshire's benefit. Their take, all of it, was being beamed after Antelope to make certain she had full and complete tactical records of the moment she hypered out. And that same information was being transmitted to Antelope's sister ship, TFNS Gazelle, as she lay totally covert in orbit around the system's outermost gas giant. Her task was to remain hidden until the end, if she could, and then report back to old Earth. "It's a good thing she's out there," Fafeo thought grimly, "because we certainly aren't going to be making any reports." "Ship status?" he asked. "All combat systems are closed up at Condition 4, sir. Engineering reports all stations manned and ready. Both normal space and hyperdrives are online, prepared to answer maneuvering commands." "Very good," Fafeo pointed at her normally assigned command station and watched her head for it. Then he inhaled deeply and pressed a stud on the arm of his command chair. "This is the captain," he said, without the usual formalities of an all-hands announcement. "By now, you all know what's going on. At the moment, you know just as much as these people as I do. I don't know if they're the Gbaba or not. If they are, it doesn't look very good. But I want all of you to know that I'm proud of you. Whatever happens, no captain could have a better ship or a better crew." He released the comm stud and swiveled his chair to face the heavy cruiser's helmsman. "Bring us to 015119er at 50 gravities," he said quietly. The TFNS Swiftsure moved to position herself between the planet whose human colonist had named it Crestwell's World and the mammoth armada bearing down upon it. Mateus Fafeo had always been proud of his ship, proud of her crew, of her speed, of the massive firepower packed into her 750,000-ton hull. At the moment, what he was most aware of was her frailty. Until 10 years earlier, there had been no Terran Federation Navy. Not really. There had been something the Federation called a Navy, but it had actually been little more than a fleet of survey vessels, backed up by a handful of light armed units, whose main concerns had been search and rescue operations and the suppression of occasional, purely human predators. But then, 10 years ago, a Federation survey ship had found evidence of the first confirmed advanced non-human civilization. No one knew what that civilization's citizens had called themselves, because none of them were still alive to tell anyone. Humanity had been shocked by the discovery that an entire species had been deliberately destroyed, that a race capable of fully developing and exploiting the resources of its home star system had been ruthlessly wiped out. The first assumption had been that the species in question had done it to itself in some sort of mad spasm of suicidal fury. Indeed, some of the scientists who'd studied the evidence continued to maintain that that was the most likely explanation. Those holdouts, however, were a distinct minority. Most of the human race had finally accepted the second and far more horrifying hypothesis. They hadn't done it to themselves, someone else had done it to them. Fafeo didn't know who'd labeled the hypothetical killers the Gbaba. He didn't much care. But the realization that they might exist was the reason there was a genuine and steadily growing Federation Navy these days, and the reason contingency plans like Spyglass and Watchmen had been put into place, and the reason TFNS Swiftsure found herself between Crestwell's world and the incoming, still totally silent fleet of red icons. There was no way in the universe a single heavy cruiser could hope to stop or slow down or even inconvenience a fleet the size of the one-headed Fafeo's ship. Nor was it likely he could have stayed away from hostile warships capable of the acceleration rate the unknowns had already demonstrated. But even if he could have, that wasn't Swiftshure's job. Even at their massive acceleration rate, it would take the bogies almost 4 hours to reach Crestwell's world, assuming they wanted to rendezvous with it. If all they wanted to do was overfly the planet, they could do it in less than 3. But whatever their intention, it was Swiftshure's job to stand her ground, to do her damnedest, up to the very last instant, to open some sort of peaceful communication with the unknowns, to serve as a fragile shield and tripwire which might be, just possibly, however remote the possibility might be, deter an attack on the newly settled planet behind her, and almost certainly to become the first casualty in the war the Federation had dreaded for almost a decade. "Sir, we're picking up additional drive signatures," Lieutenant Henderson announced. "They look like fighters." Her voice was crisp, professionally clipped. "Tracking makes it roughly 400. Acknowledged. Still no response to our transmission communications?" "None, sir," the comm officer replied tautly. "Tactical begin deploying missiles." "Aye, sir," Henderson said. "Deploying missiles now." Big, long-range missiles detached from the external ordnance rings, while others went gliding out of the cruiser's midship missile hatches. They spread out in a cloud about Swiftsure on their secondary station-keeping drives, far enough out to put the ship and her fellow missiles safely outside the threat perimeter of their preposterously powerful primary drives. "Looks like they want to englobe the planet," he thought, watching the bogey's formation continue to spread while his ship's unceasing communication attempts beamed toward them. That doesn't look especially peaceful-minded of them. He glanced at the master plot's range numbers. The intruders had been inbound for almost 116 minutes now. Their velocity relative to Crestwell's world was up to just over 31,000 kilometers per second. Unless they reversed acceleration in the next few seconds, they were going to overfly the planet after all. "I wonder." "Missile launch," Gabriella Henderson announced suddenly. "Repeat, missile launch. Mini missiles inbound." Mateus Fafeo's heart seemed to stop. They can't possibly expect to actually hit an invading starship at that range. That was his first thought as the thousands of incoming missile icons suddenly speckled his plot. But they can sure as hell hit a planet, can't they? His brain told him an instant later. He stared at the hurricanes of missiles and knew what was going to happen. Swiftshure's defenses could never have stopped more than a tithe of that torrent of destruction. A frozen corner of his mind wondered what they were armed with. Fusion warheads, antimatter, chemical or biological agents, or perhaps they were simply kinetic weapons. With the prodigious acceleration they were showing, they had more than enough velocity to do the job with no warheads at all. "Communications," he heard his voice say flatly as he watched the executioners of Crestwell's world, 500,000 inhabitants, accelerating toward him. "Secure communication attempts. Maneuvering. Bring us to maximum power. Heading 000,005. Tactical." He turned his head and met Lieutenant Henderson's eyes levelly. "Prepare to engage the enemy." February 14th, 2421. TFNS Excalibur, TFNS Gulliver, Task Force 1. The scout ship was too small to be a threat to anyone. The tiny starship was less than 3% the size of TFNS Excalibur. The Task Force Dreadnought flagship, true, it was faster than Excalibur, and its weapons systems and electronics were somewhat more advanced, but it could not have come within a light minute of the Task Force and lived. Unfortunately, it didn't have to. "It's confirmed, sir." Captain Somerset's mahogany-skinned face was grim on Admiral Pai Kaizi's flag bridge comm screen. Excalibur's commander had aged since the task force set out, Admiral Pai thought. Of course, he was hardly alone in that. "How far out, Martin?" the Admiral asked flatly. "Just over 2.6 light minutes," Somerset replied, his expression grimmer than ever. "It's too close, Admiral." "Maybe not," Pai said. then smiled thinly at his flag captain. And whatever the range, we're stuck with it, aren't we? Sir, I could send the screen out, try and push him further back. I could even detach a destroyer squadron to sit on him, drive him completely out of the central range of the fleet. We don't know how close behind him something heavier may be. Pay shook his head. Besides, we need them to see us sooner or later, don't we? Admiral, Somerset began, I don't think we can afford to take the chance that... We can't afford not to take the chance, Pay said firmly. Go ahead and push the screen out in his direction. See if you can get him to move at least a little further out. But either way, we execute breakaway in the next half hour. Somerset looked at him out of the comm screen for another moment, then nodded heavily. Very well, sir. I'll pass the orders. Thank you, Martin, Pay said in a much softer voice, and cut the circuit. The captain may have a point, sir, a quiet contralto said from behind him, and he turned his bridge chair to face the speaker. Lieutenant Commander Nemu Albin was a very junior officer indeed, especially for an anti-Jerome society to be suggesting to a 4-star admiral, however respectfully, that his judgment might be less than infallible. Pei Kalzi felt absolutely no temptation to point that out to her, however. First, because despite her youth, she was one of the more brilliant tactical officers the Terran Federation Navy had ever produced. Second, because if anyone had earned the right to second-guess Admiral Pei, it was Lieutenant Commander Albin. He does have a point, Pei conceded. A very good one, in fact. But I've got a feeling the bad news isn't very far behind this particular raven. A feeling, sir? Albin's combination of dark hair and blue eyes were the gift of her Welsh father, but her height and fair complexion had come from her Swedish mother, Admiral Pei. On the other hand, was a small, wiry man, over 3 times her age, and she seemed to tower over him, and she raised one eyebrow. Still, he was pleased to note, in a bittersweet sort of way, it wasn't an incredulous expression. After all, he told himself, my penchant for playing a hunch has a lot to do with the fact that I'm the last full admiral Terran Federation will ever have. It's not some arcane form of ESP in this case, Nemu, he said. But where's the other scout? You know Gbaba scout ships always operate in pairs, and Captain Somerset's reported only one of them. The other fellow has to be somewhere. Like calling up the rest of the pack, Alvin said, her blue eyes dark, and he nodded. That's exactly what he's doing. They must have gotten at least a sniff of us before we picked them up, and one of them turned and headed back for help immediately. This one's going to hang on our heels, keep track of us, and home the rest in. But the one thing he isn't going to do is come in close enough to risk letting us get a good shot at him. He can't afford to let us pick him off and drop out of hyper. They might never find us again. I see where you're going, sir. Alvin looked thoughtful for a moment, her blue eyes intent on something only she could see, and returned her attention to the Admiral. Sir, she asked quietly, would I be out of line if I used one of the priority comm circuits to contact Gulliver? I'd like to tell the Commodore goodbye. Of course you wouldn't be, Pei replied, equally quietly. And when you do, tell him I'll be thinking about him. Sir, you could tell him yourself. No. Pei shook his head. Kai Jung and I have already said our goodbyes, Nemu. Yes, sir. The word spread quickly from Excalibur as the 10th Destroyer Squadron headed for the Gbaba Scout. A cold, ugly wave of fear come with the news. Not panic, perhaps, because every single member of the murdered Federation's final fleet had known in his heart of hearts that this moment would come. Indeed, they'd planned for it, but that made no one immune from the fear when it actually came. More than one of the officers in ratings watched the destroyer's icon sweep across the tactical displays toward the scout ship, prayed silently that they would overtake the fleet little ship, destroy it. They knew how unlikely that was to happen, and even if it did, it would probably buy them no more than a few more weeks, possibly a few months. That didn't keep them from praying. Aboard the heavy cruiser TFNS Gulliver, a small, wiry Commodore said a prayer of his own, not for the destruction of the scout ship, not even for his older brother who was about to die, but for a young lieutenant commander who had become almost a daughter to him, and who had volunteered to transfer to Excalibur, knowing the ship could not survive. Commodore Pei, you have a comm request from the flag. His communications officer said quietly. It's Nemu, sir. Thank you, Oscar. Pei Ka-young said. Put her through to my display here. Yes, sir. Nemu, Pei said, as the familiar oval face of the sapphire blue eyes appeared on the display. The Commodore, she replied. I'm sure you've heard by now. Indeed. We're preparing to execute breakaway even now. I know you would be. Your brother, the Admiral, asked me to tell you he'll be thinking about you. So will I. And I know you'll be thinking about us too, sir. That's why I wanted to take this chance to tell you. She looked directly into his eyes. It's been an honor and a privilege to serve under you, sir. I regret nothing which has ever happened since you selected me for your staff. That means a great deal to me, Namu, Pace said very softly. Like his brother, he was a traditionalist, and it was not the way of his culture to be emotionally demonstrative. But he knew she saw the pain in his eyes. May I also say, he added, that I am deeply grateful for all the many services you have performed. It sounded horribly stilted in his own ear, but was the closest either of them dared come over a public comm circuit, especially since all the message traffic was automatically recorded. And stilted or no, she understood what he meant, just as completely as he'd understood her. I'm glad, sir. And please, tell Shanwei goodbye for me. Give her my love. Of course, and you already know you have hers, Pace said. And then, whatever his culture might have demanded, he cleared his throat harshly. And mine, he said huskily. That means a lot, sir. Alvin smiled almost gently at him. Goodbye, Commodore. God bless. The destroyers did succeed in pushing the scout ship back, not as far as they would have liked, but far enough to give Admiral Pay a distinct feeling of relief. General signaled to all units, he said, never looking away from the master tactical display. Pass the order to execute breakaway. Aye, sir. Senior flag bridge comm rating replied, and a moment later the light codes on Pay's display flickered suddenly. Only for an instant, and only because his sensors were watching them so closely. Or, he thought wryly, that's the theory anyway. 46 huge starships killed their hyperdrives and disappeared as they dropped instantly sublight. But in the very same instant they did, 46 other starships, which had been carefully hidden away in stealth, appeared just as quickly. It was a precisely coordinated maneuver which Pay's command had practiced over and over again in the simulators, and more than a dozen times in actual space, and they performed it this one last time flawlessly. The 46 newcomers slid quickly and smoothly into the holes which had abruptly appeared in the formation, and their drives, emissions, and signatures were almost perfect matches for those of the ships which had disappeared. That's going to be a nasty surprise for the Gbaba, Pay told himself coldly, and one of these days it's going to lead to an even bigger, nastier surprise for them. You know, he said, turning away from the display to face Lieutenant Commander Albin and Captain Joseph Thyssen, his chief of staff, who came so close to kicking these people's asses. Another 50 years, 75 at the outside, and we could have taken them, star-spanning empire or no. I think that's probably a little over-optimistic, sir, Thyssen replied after a moment. We never did find out how big their empire actually is, you know. It wouldn't have mattered. Pay shook his head sharply. We're in a virtual dead heat with them technologically right now, Joe. Right now. And how old are their ships? Some of them are brand new, sir, Numu Allen replied, for the chief of staff. But I take your point, she continued, and even Thyssen nodded almost unwillingly. Pay didn't press the argument. There was no reason to, not now. Although in some ways it would have been an enormous relief to tell someone besides Nemu what was really about to happen. But he couldn't do that to Thyssen. The chief of staff was a good man, one who believed absolutely in the underlying premises of Operation Ark. Like every other man and woman under Pay's command, he was about to give his life to ensure that Operation Ark succeeded, and the Admiral couldn't tell him that his own commanding officer was part of a plot against the people charged with making that success happen. Do you think we gave them enough of a shock that they may start actively innovating, sir? Thyssen asked after a moment. Pay looked at him and raised one eyebrow. The chief of staff shrugged a crooked smile. I like to think we at least made the bastards sweat, sir. Oh, I think you can safely assume that we did, Pay replied with a humorless smile of his own. As to whether or not it will change them, I really don't know. The xenologist's best guess is that it won't. They've got a system and culture which have worked for them for at least 8,000 or 9,000 years. We may have been a bigger bump in the road than they're accustomed to, but the formula worked in our case too. In the end, they'll probably be a little nervous for a century or three, if only because they'll wonder if we got another colony away somewhere without their noticing. But then they'll settle back down. Until the next poor dumb suckers come stumbling into them, Thyssen said bitterly. Until then, Pay agreed and turned back to the display. 8,000 or 9,000 years, he thought. That's a xenologist's best guess, but I'll bet it's actually been longer than that. God, I wonder how long ago the first Gbaba discovered fire. It was a question he'd pondered more than once over the 4 decades it had taken the Gbaba Empire to destroy the human race. For two things the Gbaba definitely were not, were innovative or flexible. At first, the Gbaba had clearly underestimated the challenge mankind posed. Their first few fleets had only outnumbered their intended victims 3 or 4 to 1, and it became quickly and painfully obvious that they couldn't match humanity's tactical flexibility. The first genocidal attack had punched inward past Crestwell to take out 3 of the Federation's 14 major extrasolar star systems and 100% civilian casualties. But then the Federation Navy had rallied and stopped them cold. The fleet had even counterattacked and captured no less than 6 Gbaba star systems, which was when the full Gbaba fleet mobilized. Commander Pei Kal-Z had been a fire control officer aboard one of the Federation's ships of the line in the Starfall system when the real Gbaba Navy appeared. My apologies. He could still remember the displays, see the endless waves of scarlet icons, each representing a Gbaba capital ship, as they materialized out of hyper like curses. It had been like driving a ground car into a crimson snowflakes, except that no snow had ever sent such an ice-cold shudder through the marrow of his bones. He still didn't know how Admiral Thomas had gotten any of her fleet out. Most of Thomas's ships had died with her, covering the flight of a handful of survivors whose duty had been not to stand and share her death, but to live with the dreadful news, to flee frantically homeward, arriving on the very wings of the storm to warn mankind apocalypse was coming. Not that humanity had ever been taken totally unawares. The severity of the opening Gbaba attack, even if it had been thrown back, had been a brutal wake-up call. Every Federation world had begun arming and fortifying when the first evidence of the Gbaba's existence had appeared, 10 years before Crestwell. After Crestwell, those preparations had been pressed at a frenetic pace, and a star system made an awesome fortress. The surviving fleet elements had fallen back on the fixed defenses, standing and fighting to the death in defense of humanity's worlds, and they'd made the Gbaba pay a hideous price in dead and broken starships. But the Gbaba had chosen to pay it. Not even the xenologist had been able to come up with a satisfactory explanation for why the Gbaba flatly refused to even consider negotiations. They, or their translating computers at any rate, obviously comprehended standard English, since they clearly used captured data and documents, and the handful of broken, scarred human prisoners who'd been recovered from them had been interrogated with a casual, dispassionate brutality that was horrifying. So humanity had known communication with them was at least possible, and yet they'd never responded to a single official communication attempt, except to press their attacks harder. Personally, Pei wondered if they were actually still capable of a reasoned response at all. Some of the ships of the Federation had captured or knocked out and been able to examine had been ancient almost beyond belief. At least one, according to the scientists who had analyzed it, had been built at least 2 millennia before its capture, yet there was no indication of any significant technological advance between the time of its construction and its final battle. Ships which, as Albin had suggested, were brand new construction had mounted identical weapons, computers, hyperdrives, and sensor suites. That suggested a degree of cultural stagnation which even Pei's ancestral China, at its most conservative rejection of the outside world, had never approached. One which made even ancient Egypt seem like a hotbed of innovation. It was impossible for Pei to conceive of any sentient beings who would go that long without any major advances. So perhaps the Gbaba no longer were sentient in the human sense of the term. Perhaps everything, all of this, was simply the result of a set of cultural imperatives so deeply ingrained they become literally instinctual. None of which had saved the human race from destruction. It had taken time, of course. The Gbaba had been forced to reduce humanity's readouts one by one. In massive sieges which had taken literally years to conclude, the Federation Navy had been rebuilt behind the protection of the system fortifications, manned by new officers and ratings, many of whom, like Namu Albin, had never known a life in which humanity's back was not against the wall. That Navy had struck back in desperate sallies and sorties which had cost the Gbaba dearly, but the final outcome had been inevitable. The Federation Assembly had tried sending out colony fleets, seeking to build hidden refuges where some remnants of humanity might ride out the tempest. But however inflexible or unimaginative the Gbaba might be, they'd obviously encountered that particular trick before, for they'd englobed each of the Federation's remaining star systems with scout ships. Escorting Navy task forces might attain a crushing local superiority, fight away through the scouts and thinner shell of the capital ships backing them up, but the scouts always seemed to be able to maintain contact, or regain it quickly, and every effort to run the blockade had been hunted down. One colony fleet had slipped through the scouts, but only to transmit a last despairing hypercom message less than 10 years later. It might have eluded the immediate shell of scout ships, but others had been sent out after it. It must have taken literally thousands of them to scour all the possible destinations that colony fleet might have chosen, but eventually one of them had stumbled across it, and the killer fleets had followed. The colony administrator's best guess was that the colony's own emissions had led the Gbaba to them, despite all the colonists' efforts to limit those emissions. Pace suspected that long-dead administrator had been right. That, at any rate, was an underlying assumption of Operation Arch Planners. At least we managed to push their damn scout ship far enough back to give Breakaway a fighting chance to work, Tyson observed. Pay nodded. The comment came under the heading of blindingly obvious, but he wasn't about to fault anyone for that at a moment like this. Besides, Joe probably meant it as a compliment, he thought, with something very like a mental chuckle. After all, Breakaway had been Pay's personal brainchild, the sleight of hand intended to convince the Gbaba that successfully tracked down and totally destroyed mankind's last desperate colonization attempt. That was why the 46 dreadnoughts and carriers which had accompanied the rest of his task force in stealth had not fired a missile or launched a fighter during the fight to break through the shell of capital ships covering the Gbaba scout globe around the Sol system. It had been a stiffer engagement, although its outcome had never been in doubt. But by hiding under stealth, aided by the background emissions of heavy weapons fire and the dueling electronic warfare systems of the opposing forces, they had hopefully remained undetected and unsuspected by the Gbaba. The sacrifice of 2 full destroyer squadrons who dropped behind to pick off the only scout ships close enough to actually hold the escaping colony fleet on sensors had allowed Pai to break free and run, and deep inside, he'd hoped they'd managed to stay away from the Gbaba scouts, that despite all odds, all of his fleet might yet survive. But whatever he hoped, he never really expected it, and that was why those ships had stayed in stealth until this moment. When the Gbaba Navy arrived, and it would, for all of their age, Gbaba ships were still faster than human vessels. It would find exactly the same number of ships its scouts had reported fleeing Sol. Exactly the same number of ships its scouts had reported when they finally made contact with the fugitives once again. And whenever one of those ships was destroyed, whenever one of the humans chewing them had been killed, the Gbaba would assume they destroyed all of those fugitives. But they'll be wrong, Pei Kalzi told himself softly, coldly, and one of these days, despite everything people like Langhorne and Bedard can do to stop it, we'll be back. And then, you bastards, you'll... Admiral, Lemieux Albin said quietly. Long-range sensors had picked up incoming hostiles. He turned and looked at her, and she met his eyes levelly. We have 2 positive contacts, sir, she told him. CIC makes the first one approximately 1,000 point sources. The second one is larger. Well, he observed almost whimsically. At least they cared enough to send the very best, didn't they? He looked at Tyson. Send the fleet to action stations, if you please, he said. Launch fighters, and begin pre-positioning missiles for launch. That was Chapter 1 of Off Armageddon Reef. The next chapter, we will see if anybody survived. We'll get to see if the Gbaba caught on to their plan, or if they went on like nothing had happened. Again, I will put up a picture and show where you can get this and how much it is. It's a very good series. There are currently 10 books in the series, so it's going to be quite a bit of material for us to be able to get through together. And we're actually waiting, I am eagerly waiting for the next one to come out. So if anybody knows Mr. Weber, please ask him if he might be able to speed it up. So, as always, like, share, subscribe. Remember that I love you, God loves you. Be kind, be positive, and we will see you next time. Peace.